There is a particular kind of book that exists less as a single fixed text, and more as a centuries-long rumour that eventually got written down, copied, miscopied, translated, mistranslated, and reassembled by different hands across different countries, until nobody could say with any certainty who actually wrote it or when. The Lesser Key of Solomon, sometimes called by its Latin-flavoured name the Lemegeton, is exactly this kind of book. For centuries it circulated quietly among a small scattered network of scholars, occult practitioners, and collectors of forbidden knowledge, copied by hand in private libraries, locked away in cabinets, occasionally seized by religious or civil authorities, occasionally burned, and yet somehow generation after generation it kept resurfacing. It is one of the most famous grimoires in Western history, a word that simply means a book of magical knowledge and instruction, and it sits today at a strange crossroads between serious academic history, the modern occult revival, and a vast layer of popular culture that has absorbed its imagery, often without anyone involved knowing where that imagery actually came from. What makes the Lesser Key of Solomon worth understanding is not whether the claims inside it are true. That is a question this video is not equipped to answer and does not intend to try. What makes it worth understanding is the much more answerable and, in some ways, much more interesting historical question of how a text like this came to exist at all, why it attached itself to the name of the biblical King Solomon centuries after his death, why it terrified and fascinated European society in roughly equal measure for hundreds of years, why governments and churches occasionally treated mere possession of a copy as a punishable offence, and why, in the 21st century, fragments of its structure and imagery have ended up echoing through horror movies, video games, heavy metal album art and internet forums, almost always stripped of the actual historical context that produced them in the first place. The book's full traditional title, in most of the surviving manuscript versions, is something like Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, the Little Key of Solomon, a title deliberately designed to position it as a smaller, more practical companion to an even older and more famous legendary work, the Key of Solomon or Clavicula Salomonis, which had circulated in various forms since at least the medieval period, and which itself claimed falsely to have been written by King Solomon directly. This naming convention alone tells you something important about how grimoires like this one actually worked as a literary and cultural phenomenon. They were rarely the product of a single identifiable author sitting down with original ideas. They were compilations, accretions, layers built up over generations, frequently borrowing the prestige of an ancient legendary biblically sanctioned name, in this case Solomon, a king famous throughout Jewish, Christian and Islamic tradition for his supposed wisdom and his supposed mastery over supernatural forces, in order to lend authority and mystique to material that was, in actual historical fact, assembled centuries after his death by anonymous European compilers working in a completely different cultural and religious context than the ancient Near East Solomon himself would have inhabited. In this video, we are going to walk through the actual documented history of this text, as carefully as the surviving evidence allows, examining where the Solomon legend itself comes from, how medieval and early modern European magical literature developed the broader grimoire tradition the Lemegeton belongs to, what specific historical manuscripts and figures are actually involved in its compilation, why it acquired its reputation as a dangerous and forbidden text, how it was rediscovered and popularized in the 19th and 20th century occult revival, and how it continues to echo through contemporary culture today. This is a history of an idea and an object moving through time, shaping and being shaped by the anxieties, ambitions and imaginations of the people who encountered it across nearly 1,000 years of European intellectual history. Let's begin where any honest account of this book has to begin, with the legend of King Solomon himself, and how a Bronze Age Israelite king came to be remembered, more than 1,000 years after his death, as the greatest magician the world had ever known. To understand why a medieval European magical text would attach itself to the name of King Solomon, you first have to understand how dramatically the historical memory of Solomon transformed over the many centuries between his actual reign and the appearance of texts like the Lemegeton. The Solomon described in the Hebrew Bible, primarily in the books of Kings and Chronicles, is a figure remembered chiefly for wisdom, wealth, and the construction of the Great Temple in Jerusalem. The biblical text does describe Solomon's wisdom in fairly expansive terms, including, in one famous passage, the claim that he had knowledge of trees, animals, birds and fish, and that rulers from distant lands came to test his understanding with difficult questions. This portrait of an extraordinarily wise, well-resourced king became, over the following centuries, fertile ground for an entirely separate and much more elaborate legendary tradition to grow on top of it. By the time of the Second Temple period and into the early centuries of the Common Era, Jewish and later Christian and Islamic folklore had begun attributing to Solomon something considerably beyond wisdom in the conventional sense. Texts and oral traditions began describing Solomon as having been granted direct command over supernatural beings, sometimes described as demons or spirits, who were compelled, according to these legendary accounts, to serve him and assist with monumental tasks, including, in some versions of the legend, the construction of the temple itself. One of the most influential surviving texts in this tradition is a work called the Testament of Solomon, likely composed sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, which describes Solomon receiving a magical ring from the Archangel Michael that gave him power over a long list of named spirits, each one bound to confess their specific harmful influence over humanity and their specific weakness or vulnerability before being put to forced labour on the temple's construction. This text is genuinely important to the later history of the Lemegeton because it establishes, many centuries before any medieval European grimoire existed, the basic narrative template that later texts would borrow and elaborate: a wise king, divine or angelic authorization, a structured list of named spirits, and a specific method of compelling and controlling them. This legendary tradition continued developing and spreading across multiple religious and cultural contexts throughout the medieval period. Islamic tradition, drawing on its own scriptural references to Solomon's command over jinn, developed a rich parallel body of legend regarding Solomon's supernatural authority, some of which circulated and cross-pollinated with European traditions through the considerable scholarly and cultural contact between the Islamic world and medieval Europe, particularly through the transmission of Arabic scientific, astrological, and philosophical texts into Latin Europe from roughly the 12th century onward. European Christian culture, meanwhile, developed its own elaborations, often filtering older Solomon legends through the framework of medieval Christian demonology, a developing and increasingly systematic body of theological and folk belief about the nature, hierarchy, and behaviour of demons that was itself undergoing significant elaboration throughout the medieval and early modern periods, partly in response to genuine theological inquiry, and partly in response to social anxieties that would eventually fuel the witch trials of the early modern period. By the time grimoires explicitly claiming Solomon's authorship begin appearing in the historical record, starting with various versions of the Key of Solomon documented from at least the 14th or 15th century onward, though likely drawing on earlier source material, the legendary Solomon being invoked bears only a loose relationship to anything in the actual biblical text. He has become, across roughly 2,000 years of legendary accretion spanning Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, something closer to a mythic archetype, the wise king who mastered the spirit world and left behind secret knowledge for those who could find and properly use it. This is the figure whose name and reputation the much later Lemegeton would borrow, centuries after the historical Solomon's death, in a medieval and early modern European context that had its own distinct concerns and its own distinct intellectual traditions about magic, demonology, and forbidden knowledge, which is exactly what the next section turns to. The Lemegeton did not appear in a vacuum. It belongs to a much broader category of literature that scholars today generally call the Western Grimoire tradition, a substantial body of magical texts that developed across medieval and early modern Europe, drawing on an unusually wide range of source material including Jewish mysticism, particularly the Kabbalah, classical Greek and Roman magical and astrological texts, Arabic and Persian scientific and occult literature transmitted into Europe through translation, and the developing body of Christian angelology and demonology produced by medieval theologians, monks, and scholars. Understanding this broader tradition is essential to understanding the Lemegeton specifically, because the Lemegeton is, in an important sense, less an original work than a kind of anthology, drawing together and reorganizing material that had already been circulating in various forms across this broader literature for generations. The earliest grimoires in this tradition that scholars have identified emerged roughly in the high medieval period, often associated, whether accurately or not, with learned clerics, since the clergy were among the few segments of medieval European society with the literacy, access to manuscripts, and specialized training in Latin, astrology, and ritual practice that producing or even reading such texts required. This is one of the genuine historical ironies that scholars of the Grimoire tradition frequently point out, that a significant portion of medieval and early modern magical literature appears to have been produced and circulated within or adjacent to clerical and monastic circles, the very institutions most publicly and doctrinally opposed to magical practice, rather than among some separate, entirely secular or anti-Christian underground. The medieval Catholic Church's official theological position generally held that magic, particularly any magic involving the invocation or compulsion of spirits, was either fraudulent or, if genuinely effective, necessarily relied on demonic assistance and was therefore spiritually dangerous and doctrinally forbidden. Yet the actual practitioners, compilers and readers of grimoire literature throughout this period frequently included clergy, monks, and other educated figures operating within or alongside the institutional church, producing a persistent and historically well-documented tension between official doctrine and actual practice. Texts in this tradition generally fell into several recognizable categories, which scholars have used to organize the otherwise sprawling and inconsistent body of surviving grimoire literature. Some texts focused primarily on astrological magic, providing instructions for creating talismans and performing rituals timed to planetary and astrological influences believed to channel specific kinds of beneficial or protective power. Other texts focused on what scholars sometimes call angel magic, providing methods for invoking and communicating with angels for purposes ranging from spiritual instruction to practical assistance. A third major category, the one most directly relevant to the Lemegeton, focused on what is generally called goetic or demonic magic, providing structured methods for identifying, invoking, and compelling various spirits, frequently catalogued as demons within the prevailing Christian theological framework in order to accomplish specific practical goals. The Key of Solomon, the older and more directly Solomon-attributed text that the Lemegeton positions itself as a companion to, falls primarily into the first and second of these categories, focusing substantially on astrological timing, talismanic construction, and ritual purity requirements, with relatively less emphasis on cataloguing specific named demonic spirits in the highly structured, list-based way the Lemegeton would later become known for. The Lemegeton itself, as it eventually took shape, drew together material reflecting several of these different categories simultaneously, combining material on spirit catalogues with material on angelic invocation, astrological timing, and ritual procedure, reflecting its character as a later compilation, pulling together strands from multiple separate earlier textual traditions rather than representing a single, unified, originally conceived work. This compilational character is, as the next section explores, central to understanding the genuinely complicated and still not entirely settled question of exactly when, where, and by whom the text we now call the Lemegeton actually came together in anything resembling its familiar modern form. One of the most persistent misconceptions surrounding the Lesser Key of Solomon, fueled partly by the text's own internal claims and partly by centuries of popular retelling, is the idea that it represents a single coherent work produced by a single identifiable author at a single identifiable moment in history. The actual scholarly picture, pieced together by historians of esotericism examining the surviving manuscript evidence, is considerably messier and, in its own way, considerably more historically interesting. The text we now generally recognize as the Lemegeton appears to have taken shape gradually, through a process of compilation, combination, and editorial reorganization carried out across multiple manuscripts produced in different locations over an extended period, likely stretching from sometime in the 16th century through the 17th century, with the surviving manuscripts that scholars rely on most heavily today dating predominantly from the 17th century. The text is traditionally understood as being divided into 5 distinct component parts, often referred to individually as separate books within the larger work, each with what appears to be a somewhat different origin and textual history, before being drawn together into the combined form that later readers and editors would come to recognize as a single unified Lemegeton. The component most closely associated in popular imagination with the Lemegeton, and the one most central to its later reputation, is the catalogue of spirits organized in a structured, hierarchical list, a section that draws heavily on and substantially reorganizes material with clear roots in much older, demonological catalogues, including direct textual relationships to earlier works like the 16th century treatise Pseudomonarchia Demonum, written by the Dutch demonologist Johann Weyer as part of a broader, explicitly critical work on witchcraft and demonology, a fact that itself illustrates the complicated, often unexpected relationships between texts that were nominally hostile to magical practice and texts that later compilers drew on directly when assembling practical magical literature. Other component sections of the Lemegeton draw on different source traditions entirely, including material with closer textual relationships to angelic invocation literature, and material reflecting astrological and talismanic traditions more closely related to the older Key of Solomon material discussed in the previous section. No single named historical author can be reliably credited with originally composing the Lemegeton as a unified text, and the various attributions that have circulated over the centuries, sometimes pointing to specific named occultists or collectors associated with particular surviving manuscript copies, generally reflect the identity of a later compiler, editor, or scribe who assembled and organized existing material into a particular manuscript version, rather than an original author who invented the content from scratch. This pattern, incidentally, is extremely common across the broader grimoire tradition discussed in the previous section, and reflects something genuinely important about how this entire category of literature functioned historically. Grimoires were living, evolving textual traditions, copied, edited, expanded, bridged, and rearranged by successive generations of scribes and collectors, each of whom might add material drawn from other sources they had access to, remove material they considered unreliable or dangerous, or reorganize existing material into new structures, producing over the centuries a substantial body of related but meaningfully different manuscript versions, none of which can be straightforwardly identified as the single original or authoritative text. This manuscript instability is precisely why, when the Lemegeton was eventually rediscovered and published in more widely accessible printed form in the modern era, a process examined in detail later in this video, the specific version that became most influential and most widely known was substantially shaped by the editorial choices of its modern compiler and translator, working from a particular set of surviving 17th century manuscripts held in the British Museum, rather than from any single stable original Lemegeton text that had existed unchanged since its earliest composition. Understanding this is essential context for everything that follows, because it means that what most modern readers encounter when they encounter the Lesser Key of Solomon today is itself the product of a specific, traceable, relatively recent historical act of editorial compilation, built on top of several more centuries of earlier, similarly compilational. Manuscript history. In the next section, we look specifically at the historical and cultural climate of the 16th and 17th centuries that produced the demonological catalogue tradition the Lemegeton draws on so heavily, a climate shaped profoundly by the witch trials and the broader early modern European preoccupation with demonology as a subject of serious, if deeply troubling intellectual inquiry. It's impossible to understand why a text like the Lemegeton, with its highly structured catalogue of named spirits, took the specific shape it did, without understanding the broader intellectual and social climate of the 16th and 17th century Europe in which its core demonological material was assembled. This was the period of the European witch trials, one of the darkest chapters in early modern European history, during which tens of thousands of people, the overwhelming majority of them women, were accused, tried, and frequently executed across a broad swathe of European territory on charges of witchcraft, often involving alleged pacts with or service to demonic forces. This period also produced, somewhat paradoxically, an enormous body of serious, scholarly, university-trained intellectual writing on the subject of demonology, much of it produced by educated theologians, lawyers, and physicians attempting to systematize and rationalize within the intellectual frameworks available to them at the time exactly what demons were, how they operated, what powers they possessed, and how they could be identified, resisted, or in some specific scholarly and clerical contexts, even communicated with or controlled. This intellectual climate produced several influential demonological treatises that the Lemegeton Spirit Catalogue draws on directly or indirectly. The most significant of these, mentioned briefly in the previous section, is Johann Weier's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, published in the 1560s as an appendix to his broader treatise on witchcraft, De Praestigiis Daemonum. Weier's overall project was explicitly skeptical and protective in intent. He argued, against the prevailing climate of his time, that many people accused of witchcraft were innocent, often suffering from what he characterized using the medical and psychological understanding available to him as mental illness or delusion rather than genuine demonic involvement. And he advocated, at real personal and professional risk during a period when such skepticism could itself draw dangerous suspicion, for more cautious, evidence-based standards before condemning accused individuals to death. The Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, somewhat ironically given this protective intent, presented a systematic catalogue of demonic hierarchy, organising numerous named spirits by rank, describing their supposed specific powers and characteristics, in a format apparently intended to demonstrate the absurdity and unreliability of existing demonological law by laying it out in exhaustive, almost bureaucratic detail, but which subsequent grimoire compilers, with very different intentions than Wire's own skeptical project, drew on directly as source material for organising their own catalogues of spirits within explicitly magical, rather than skeptical or protective, texts. This produces one of the more genuinely strange and historically significant ironies in the entire history of the Lemegeton. A substantial portion of its core demonological catalogue material traces back, through a documented chain of textual borrowing, to a work originally written with the explicit purpose of undermining belief in demonic involvement in witchcraft and protecting accused individuals from execution, a purpose almost entirely opposite to the practical magical use that later grimoire compilers would put the same catalogue material toward. Other demonological writers of the period, including figures like Jean Bodin, who argued for considerably harsher and more credulous positions regarding the reality and danger of witchcraft than Wire did, and various other continental demonologists writing in Latin for an educated, university-trained readership, contributed additional material and additional systematizing impulses to this broader 16th and 17th century intellectual climate, out of which the eventual compilers of the Lemegeton Spirit Catalogue drew their material. This historical context matters enormously for understanding what the Lemegeton actually represents as a historical artifact. It is not simply a standalone magical curiosity that emerged from nowhere. It is, in an important sense, a downstream product of an entire serious, university-trained, theologically engaged intellectual tradition of demonological scholarship that developed across early modern Europe in direct response to, and in direct intellectual engagement with, one of the most severe and most consequential moral panics in European history, repurposed by later compilers, working within the older Solomonic grimoire tradition, discussed in Section 3, into a structured practical manual rather than a piece of either skeptical argument or theological treatise. Understanding this lineage helps explain both the text's specific structural features, its tendency toward exhaustive, almost legalistic cataloguing of named entities with specific attributed characteristics, and its broader historical reputation as dangerous, since the underlying demonological tradition it draws on was itself produced during, and directly entangled with, one of the most genuinely dangerous and deadly periods of religiously motivated persecution in European history. In the next section, we turn to how texts like the Lemegeton were actually regarded, regulated, and in many documented cases, suppressed by the religious and civil authorities across this same broader period. The popular characterization of the Lesser Key of Solomon as a banned book is not simply a marketing flourish invented by modern publishers and booksellers looking to add mystique to their product, though that marketing dynamic, examined later in this video, has certainly amplified and somewhat distorted the original historical reality. There is genuine, documented historical basis for treating grimoire literature broadly, including the textual traditions that eventually fed into the Lemegeton, as having been subject to serious legal and ecclesiastical restriction across multiple periods and jurisdictions in European history, even though the specific, precise history of restrictions targeting the Lemegeton by that exact name is considerably less documented than the restrictions targeting the broader category of literature it belongs to. Medieval and early modern European law generally treated the practice of magic, and particularly any practice involving the invocation of spirits, demonic or otherwise, as a serious offence, with the specific legal framework and severity of punishment varying considerably across different periods, regions, and political jurisdictions. Ecclesiastical courts, operating under canon law, administered by the Catholic Church, and later under the parallel frameworks developed by various Protestant churches following the Reformation, generally held jurisdiction over matters of heresy and magical practice for much of the medieval period, with punishments ranging from penance and excommunication for less severe cases to, in the most severe cases, transfer to secular authorities for capital punishment, particularly once magical practice became closely associated, in both popular and official thinking, with the broader witchcraft panic discussed in the previous section. Secular civil law in many European jurisdictions developed increasingly specific statutes criminalizing witchcraft and related magical practice over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, with several countries, including England under statutes passed during the reigns of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I, enacting specific witchcraft acts that criminalized various forms of magical practice, including, in some versions of these laws, the specific act of invoking or conjuring spirits, with penalties that in their most severe forms included execution. Mere possession of grimoire literature, separate from any accusation of actually practicing magic, could itself draw serious legal and ecclesiastical consequences in various periods and jurisdictions, particularly once a specific text or category of text had become associated in official thinking with genuinely dangerous or heretical practice. Inquisitorial records from various Catholic European jurisdictions document numerous cases of individuals investigated, tried, and in some cases punished specifically for owning, copying, or circulating grimoire manuscripts, treating the books themselves as material evidence of dangerous intent or practice, independent of whether the specific individual involved could be shown to have actually performed any of the rituals described within them. This produced, across the broader grimoire tradition, a strong and historically well-founded incentive towards secrecy, anonymity, and careful limited circulation among trusted networks of collectors and practitioners, a pattern that itself reinforced and amplified these texts' reputation for danger and forbidden status, since a body of literature that genuinely could expose its owners to serious legal and physical risk naturally tended to circulate quietly in small numbers among networks of people willing to accept that risk, rather than openly through ordinary book trade channels. It's important to be careful and historically precise here, since popular accounts of grimoire literature frequently overstate or sensationalize the specific scale and frequency of legal action taken against grimoire owners and copyists, sometimes implying a level of systematic, centrally organized suppression that the actual surviving legal and ecclesiastical records don't fully support across every period and region. The reality documented by historians is somewhat more uneven. Certain periods, certain regions, and certain specific political and religious climates produced considerably more aggressive enforcement against magical literature and practice than others, with the most intense periods of legal danger generally overlapping with the peak decades of the broader witch trial panic across various parts of Europe, roughly spanning the late 15th through late 17th centuries, with considerable regional variation in both timing and severity. By the 18th century, as the broader European intellectual climate shifted decisively toward Enlightenment rationalism, and as formal witchcraft prosecutions declined dramatically and were eventually abolished as a legal category across most of Europe, the specific legal danger associated with simply owning grimoire literature declined substantially as well. Even as the broader cultural stigma and fascination surrounding such texts persisted in different forms, a transition explored further in the next section. The story of the Lemegeton's actual physical and textual survival across the centuries between its compilation in the 16th and 17th centuries and its eventual modern publication in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is, in its own quiet way, just as historically interesting as the more dramatic story of legal danger and ecclesiastical suppression covered in the previous section, because it raises the genuinely puzzling question of exactly how and why texts that carried real social and legal risk continued to be copied, preserved, and passed along by collectors across multiple subsequent generations, well into a period when the original religious and legal climate that had made such texts dangerous had substantially changed. Part of the answer lies in the specific character of the people who tended to collect and preserve grimoire manuscripts across this period, who were frequently drawn from a relatively narrow but historically significant social category: educated antiquarians, private book collectors, and scholars with a serious intellectual interest in the history of esoteric and occult literature, often operating within or adjacent to broader scholarly and scientific networks of the 17th and 18th centuries. This was, after all, the same general period that produced figures whose work straddled what we might today consider very different categories: scientific inquiry and occult or alchemical interest, including, famously, Isaac Newton himself, who maintained extensive private interests and substantial private writing on alchemy and biblical prophecy, alongside his foundational work in physics and mathematics, reflecting a broader intellectual climate in which the boundaries between what we would now call science, magic, and theology were considerably less rigid and less mutually exclusive than they would later become. Private libraries and manuscript collections assembled by figures with this kind of broad antiquarian and esoteric interest provided the actual physical mechanism by which grimoire manuscripts, including the various manuscript versions that would eventually be drawn together into the Lemegeton as we know it today, survived across the 18th and into the 19th century, frequently passing through several successive private owners, sometimes purchased and sold at auction alongside other rare manuscripts and antiquarian books, before eventually, in several documented cases relevant to the Lemegeton specifically, ending up in the manuscript holdings of major institutional libraries, including the British Museum, whose collection would eventually include several of the specific 17th century manuscript versions that later became central to the modern published edition of the text, examined in detail in the next section. This period of relatively quiet institutional and private preservation, stretching across roughly 2 centuries between the original compilation of the relevant manuscripts and their eventual modern rediscovery and publication, occurred against the backdrop of a broader European intellectual climate that had grown considerably more sceptical and dismissive of magical and demonological literature as a serious subject of belief, even as it grew, somewhat paradoxically, more interested in such literature as a subject of historical, antiquarian, and folkloric curiosity. Enlightenment intellectual culture, broadly speaking, tended to treat grimoire literature as a fascinating but ultimately superstitious relic of a less rational past, worth preserving and studying as a historical curiosity and a window into earlier mentalities, but not generally treated as a serious or credible guide to actual supernatural practice by the educated readers and collectors who continue to acquire and preserve such manuscripts during this period. This shift in framing, from genuinely dangerous and forbidden practical literature to historical and antiquarian curiosity, set the stage for the dramatically different cultural reception the text would receive when it was eventually rediscovered, edited, and published for a much wider readership during the occult revival of the late 19th century, a development driven substantially by the work of one particularly significant and colourful figure in the history of Western esotericism, whom the next section introduces. To understand how a centuries-old manuscript tradition, preserved quietly in private collections and institutional archives, eventually became the widely known, widely published text that most modern readers associate with the name Lesser Key of Solomon, you have to understand the broader cultural phenomenon historians call the Victorian occult revival, a substantial and genuinely significant current within late 19th century British and European intellectual and cultural life that has often been somewhat underappreciated in mainstream historical accounts of the period, despite involving a considerable number of serious, educated, socially prominent participants. The Victorian era, despite its frequently cited reputation for buttoned-up rationalism, industrial progress, and religious orthodoxy, also produced a substantial and genuinely widespread fascination with spiritualism, the occult, and various forms of esoteric and mystical practice, a fascination that drew participants from across the social spectrum, including a notable number of scientifically trained, socially prominent, and intellectually serious individuals who saw no fundamental contradiction between their scientific or rationalist commitments and their interest in occult and esoteric subjects, much as had been true of figures like Newton in the earlier period discussed in the previous section. This broader cultural current produced several influential organisations dedicated to the serious, systematic study and practice of Western esotericism, the most historically significant of which, for purposes of understanding the Lemegeton's eventual publication and influence, was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in London in 1888 by a small group of prominent Freemasons with serious existing interests in esoteric and occult study. The Golden Dawn developed an elaborate, structured system of magical and esoteric teaching, drawing on an extremely wide range of historical sources, including Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy, tarot, and the broader grimoire tradition discussed earlier in this video, organising this disparate material into a structured curriculum of graded initiation and practical instruction for its members. Among the Order's most historically significant members, at least for the specific purposes of this video's subject, was Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the Order's 3 founding chiefs, an extraordinarily prolific scholar, translator and editor of historical esoteric texts who dedicated a substantial portion of his career to locating, translating and publishing previously obscure or difficult to access historical manuscripts in the broader Western esoteric and grimoire tradition, making them available, often for the first time, to a wider audience of serious students and practitioners beyond the narrow circle of specialist antiquarian collectors who had previously been the primary custodians of such material. Mathers's broader project of locating and publishing historical grimoire manuscripts reflected a genuine and serious scholarly methodology, even though his specific translations and editorial choices have since been examined and in various respects critiqued by subsequent, more rigorously trained academic historians of esotericism. He worked extensively with manuscripts held in major institutional collections, including the British Museum, and produced published editions and translations of several major texts within the broader Solomonic grimoire tradition, including a published translation of the older Key of Solomon text discussed earlier in this video. This broader Victorian occult revival climate, with its serious institutional study of esoteric history, its access to major manuscript collections previously available mainly to specialist antiquarians, and its genuine scholarly and practical interest in systematically recovering and publishing the historical grimoire tradition, created exactly the conditions necessary for the specific 17th century manuscript material that had been quietly preserved across the previous 2 centuries, as discussed in the previous section, to finally be drawn together, edited, and published in something resembling the form most modern readers now recognize as the Lesser Key of Solomon, a story the next section examines in specific, focused detail. The specific published text that the overwhelming majority of modern readers encounter when they pick up a copy of the Lesser Key of Solomon today did not emerge directly from Mathers's broader Golden Dawn translation project discussed in the previous section, but rather from the editorial work of a considerably more controversial and considerably more widely known figure in the history of Western esotericism, Aleister Crowley, the English occultist, writer, and self-described magician, whose colourful, often deliberately provocative public persona and substantial body of esoteric writing made him one of the most widely recognised, and for much of the 20th century most widely condemned, figures in the entire history of Western occultism. Crowley had been initiated into the Golden Dawn in the 1890s and developed a complicated, eventually openly hostile relationship with Mathers and several other senior members of the order, a falling out that involved a substantial and well-documented dispute over the order's internal leadership, doctrine, and direction, but which did not prevent Crowley from accessing and drawing on a considerable body of material that had circulated within Golden Dawn circles, including manuscript material related to the broader Solomonic grimoire tradition. Crowley's specific editorial work on the text, now generally recognized as the Lesser Key of Solomon, involved compiling, editing, and annotating material drawn from several of the surviving 17th century manuscript copies held in the British Museum collection, organising this material into the 5-part structure that most modern published editions still follow, and adding his own substantial editorial commentary, footnotes, and interpretive framework throughout. This Crowley-edited version was first published in a limited form in the early 20th century, and was substantially expanded and republished in a more complete and widely accessible form decades later, in the mid-20th century, through the efforts of the American occultist and Crowley associate Israel Regardie, who had served as Crowley's personal secretary earlier in his career, and who, alongside several collaborators, brought together and reorganized Crowley's earlier editorial work into the more complete published edition that became the primary version through which the broader modern reading public, occultist and academic alike, would come to know the text. This specific published lineage matters enormously for understanding what most people today actually mean when they refer to the Lesser Key of Solomon, because it means the widely circulated modern text is, in a very real and traceable sense, a 20th century editorial product, shaped substantially by Crowley's own particular interpretive framework, terminology, and organizational choices, layered on top of the underlying 17th century manuscript material, which was itself, as discussed earlier in this video, a compilation drawing on still older 16th century demonological and Solomonic grimoire material. Crowley's own broader public reputation, examined in more detail in the next section, cast a long and complicated shadow over how the published Lemegeton would subsequently be received and understood by the wider public throughout the 20th century. Crowley had, by the time of his death in 1947, become one of the most sensationally covered and most widely condemned public figures associated with occultism in the English-speaking world, regularly characterized in sensationalized tabloid press coverage during his lifetime using deliberately provocative language, some of it self-cultivated by Crowley himself as part of his own carefully managed public persona, that emphasized danger, immorality, and transgression. Because the modern published edition of the Lesser Key of Solomon is so closely and so traceably associated with Crowley's specific editorial involvement, the text inherited, in the eyes of much of the mainstream 20th century public and press, a substantial portion of Crowley's own already considerable reputation for danger and notoriety, a reputational inheritance that significantly shaped, and in important respects significantly amplified, beyond what the underlying historical manuscript material on its own might have generated, the specific modern popular perception of the Lemegeton as an especially dangerous and forbidden text, a perception the next section examines in the context of Crowley's broader career and public reception. Because Crowley's editorial involvement is so central to the specific modern published text that most readers actually encounter, it's worth pausing to understand who Crowley actually was as a historical figure, separate from the considerable mythology, both self-generated and externally imposed, that has accumulated around his name. Crowley was born in 1875 into a wealthy English family with strict conservative religious affiliations, an upbringing he later described, in characteristically provocative terms throughout his extensive autobiographical writing, as deeply oppressive, and against which he spent much of his subsequent adult life deliberately and often theatrically rebelling. He was, by most accounts including those of his serious academic biographers, a genuinely talented and well-educated individual, attending Cambridge University, developing serious skill as a mountaineer with several notable expeditions to his credit, and producing a substantial body of poetry, esoteric writing and what he termed magical and philosophical literature across a long and prolific career. Crowley developed his own distinct esoteric and religious philosophy, which he called Thelema, drawing on his Golden Dawn training, his extensive travel and study of various world religious and esoteric traditions, and his own personal mystical experiences, most famously an experience in Cairo in 1904, during which he claimed to have received a text called the Book of the Law, which became the foundational scripture of his subsequent Thelemic religious and philosophical system. Crowley's public reputation throughout his lifetime, and for decades after his death, was shaped overwhelmingly by sensationalized press coverage focusing on his unconventional personal life, his deliberately transgressive public statements and behavior, and various specific controversies, including widely publicized and often exaggerated tabloid coverage of his activities at a property in Sicily that the press dubbed an abbey, coverage that contributed substantially to a popular reputation, cultivated in no small part by Crowley's own deliberate self-presentation and use of provocative rhetoric throughout his writing, as one of the most dangerous and depraved figures associated with modern occultism, with one widely circulated British tabloid headline from the 1920s famously labelling him the wickedest man in the world. Serious academic historians of religion and esotericism who have studied Crowley's actual body of work and his actual documented biography in detail have generally produced a considerably more nuanced picture than the sensationalized popular reputation suggests, one that recognizes Crowley as a genuinely significant, intellectually serious, and historically influential figure in the development of modern Western esotericism and new religious movements, while also taking seriously legitimate, well-documented criticisms of specific aspects of his personal conduct and his treatment of various people in his life, without simply accepting either the uncritically hagiographic accounts produced by some of his more devoted later followers, or the simplistically demonizing accounts produced by a sensationalized contemporary press coverage and much subsequent popular retelling. What matters most for understanding the specific subject of this video is recognizing how thoroughly Crowley's broader, complicated public reputation became entangled with the specific published text of the Lesser Key of Solomon, given his direct, well-documented editorial role in producing the modern version most readers encounter. This entanglement meant that the Lemegeton's 20th and 21st century popular reputation as a uniquely dangerous and forbidden book has been shaped substantially not only by its own genuinely complicated and centuries-old history, as traced through the earlier sections of this video, but also by the specific reputational baggage of the particular 20th century editor whose work produced the version of the text that achieved the widest modern circulation. A layering of historical reputation upon historical reputation that the next section examines as it traces how the text moved from specialist occult publishing into much broader 20th century popular culture. The path the Lesser Key of Solomon travelled from a relatively obscure specialist occult publication in the mid-20th century to a text whose imagery and structure most people in the broader culture have encountered in some diluted form, even if they have never read a page of the actual text or heard of it by name, runs primarily through the genuinely massive expansion of popular interest in occultism, horror fiction, and esoteric subject matter that occurred across American and European popular culture from roughly the 1960s onward. A broader cultural phenomenon that intersected with the specific text examined in this video in several identifiable and traceable ways. The 1960s and 1970s saw a substantial broader cultural surge of interest in occultism, astrology, and esoteric spirituality across much of the Western world, connected to the broader countercultural movements of the period, and this broader surge created considerably expanded commercial demand for published editions of historical occult and esoteric texts that had previously circulated only among small specialist communities of practitioners and collectors. Publishers responded to this demand by producing more widely available, more affordably priced editions of texts, including the Crowley and Regardie edited Lemegeton discussed in the previous two sections, making the text considerably more accessible to a much broader general readership than had previously had practical access to it. A readership that included not only serious students of esotericism, but also a much larger population of casually curious readers, horror and fantasy fiction writers researching background material, and individuals drawn primarily by the text's reputation for danger and forbidden status, rather than by any deep prior engagement with the specific historical traditions examined earlier in this video. This expanded readership and expanded cultural visibility coincided with, and substantially fed into, a parallel and genuinely massive expansion of horror, fantasy, and supernatural-themed popular media across film, television, and popular fiction throughout the same general period. An entertainment industry that found in historical grimoire literature, including the Lemegeton specifically, a rich and readily available source of evocative names, structural concepts, and visual imagery that could be borrowed, adapted, and often substantially altered for dramatic and commercial purposes, generally with little concern for historical accuracy or fidelity to the actual underlying historical texts and traditions. Specific named entities, structural concepts, and terminology drawn loosely from the broader Solomonic grimoire tradition, frequently filtered through popular secondary sources, role-playing games, and earlier popular fiction rather than direct engagement with the original historical texts, gradually entered the broader vocabulary of horror and fantasy popular culture across film, television, comics, video games, and tabletop gaming throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, producing a situation in which a very large number of people across the general population have encountered fragments, names, or general structural ideas loosely traceable back to this specific grimoire tradition, generally without any awareness of the actual, considerably more complicated, several centuries-long historical lineage examined throughout this video. This popular cultural absorption and dilution produced what scholars of contemporary esotericism and popular religion sometimes describe as a kind of historical flattening, in which an extremely specific, traceable, multi-layered historical text, with a documented lineage running from ancient Solomon legend through medieval and early modern grimoire compilation through Victorian occult revival editorial work through 20th century Thelemic publishing, becomes compressed, in much broader popular awareness, into a vague, free-floating cultural signifier of generic forbidden or dangerous magical knowledge, detached from almost all of its actual specific historical content and context. This flattening has produced genuinely interesting and somewhat ironic downstream effects, including, as the next section examines, a contemporary internet-era environment in which a considerable amount of inaccurate, exaggerated, or entirely invented claims about the text circulate widely, frequently presented with far greater confidence and far less historical grounding than anything found in the actual serious academic scholarship on the subject. The contemporary internet environment has produced a genuinely substantial volume of content related to the Lesser Key of Solomon, much of it taking the form of short videos, articles, and forum discussions that present various claims about the text's history, dangers, and supposed real-world effects with a confidence and certainty that the actual serious historical and academic scholarship on the subject examined throughout this video simply does not support. Understanding this contemporary information environment and developing some basic tools for evaluating the reliability of specific claims about the texts that circulate within it is a genuinely useful component of understanding the Lemegeton's broader contemporary cultural position. A considerable portion of contemporary popular content about the Lesser Key of Solomon tends to substantially overstate the specific documented historical evidence regarding organized suppression, censorship, and danger associated with the text, sometimes presenting dramatic but historically unsupported or only loosely supported claims about specific historical bans, specific documented incidents of harm associated with the text's use, or specific organized institutional campaigns against it, claims that frequently cannot be traced back to any specific, verifiable primary historical source when examined carefully, and that in many cases appear to have originated relatively recently within internet-era popular content itself, sometimes building on earlier popular but only loosely sourced claims found in mid to late 20th century popular occult publishing, rather than reflecting documented historical fact as established through the kind of careful archival and manuscript research that serious academic historians of esotericism, several of whose work has informed this video, have actually conducted on the subject. This pattern is not unique to the Lemegeton specifically, but reflects a broader and well-documented dynamic in how historical information about esoteric, occult, and broadly mysterious historical subjects tends to circulate and frequently degrade in reliability as it moves through successive rounds of popular retelling, particularly within a contemporary media environment that often rewards dramatic, confidently stated claims considerably more than it rewards careful, appropriately hedged, source-cited historical accuracy. A claim repeated across enough successive videos, articles, and forum posts can acquire an appearance of established fact through sheer repetition and apparent consensus, even when none of the individual sources in that chain of repetition can actually be traced back to verifiable primary historical evidence, a dynamic that has affected popular understanding of the Lemegeton considerably, given the text's genuine, well-documented historical complexity combined with its strong popular reputation for mystery and danger, which together create exactly the conditions under which exaggerated or invented claims tend to spread particularly easily and particularly persistently. This is not to say that the genuinely documented historical material examined throughout this video, the real historical witch trial era, demonological scholarship, and the real documented legal frameworks criminalizing magical practice in various periods and jurisdictions, the real documented manuscript history and editorial lineage running from the 17th century through Mathers and Crowley, is somehow unimportant or insufficiently dramatic on its own terms. The actual carefully documented history is genuinely fascinating, genuinely complex, and genuinely involves real historical danger, real persecution, and real serious intellectual and religious controversy spanning many centuries, which is precisely why this video has spent so much time walking through that actual documented history in careful, properly contextualized detail, rather than simply repeating the more dramatic but considerably less well-supported claims that circulate widely in contemporary popular content on the subject. A careful, well-sourced historical account, it turns out, doesn't need invented or exaggerated embellishment to be genuinely compelling, a point the next section returns to as we consider how serious contemporary academic scholarship on Western esotericism more broadly has approached this entire subject. Over the past several decades, the academic study of Western esotericism, including the broader Grimoire tradition that the Lemegeton belongs to, has developed into a genuinely serious, methodologically rigorous, and increasingly well-established subfield within the broader academic disciplines of religious studies and history, a development that is worth understanding both for its own sake and for what it reveals about how the actual best available historical knowledge on this subject has been produced, as distinct from the considerably less rigorous, popular content examined in the previous section. Several major European and North American universities have established dedicated academic centres, research chairs, and degree programs specifically focused on the historical study of Western esotericism over the past few decades, treating grimoire literature, occult societies, and the broader historical phenomenon of European magical and esoteric practice as a legitimate and historically significant subject of serious scholarly inquiry, deserving the same careful archival research, manuscript analysis, and contextual historical methodology that academic historians apply to any other significant historical subject, rather than treating it as a marginal curiosity unworthy of serious, sustained academic attention, which had often been the implicit or explicit position of much of the broader academic establishment in earlier generations. This developing academic field has produced a substantial and growing body of careful, well-documented scholarship specifically addressing the history of grimoire literature, including detailed manuscript studies tracing the specific textual lineage and historical development of texts within the broader Solomonic tradition that the Lemegeton belongs to. Scholarship that this video is drawn on throughout in constructing the historical account presented across its preceding sections. This serious academic scholarship generally approaches texts like the Lemegeton with a methodological stance that treats the historical existence, circulation, and cultural significance of the text and its associated beliefs as a legitimate and important subject of historical study, entirely independent of any question regarding the literal truth or falsity of the supernatural claims the text itself makes, a methodological distinction that is genuinely important and worth understanding clearly. A historian studying the Lemegeton as a serious academic subject is not generally attempting to evaluate or adjudicate whether the spirits and practices described within the text are real or effective in any literal, supernatural sense, a question that falls outside the methodological tools and professional competence of historical scholarship as a discipline. Instead, the historian is studying genuinely answerable historical questions. What specific manuscripts exist, where they came from, what earlier textual traditions they draw on, who copied, owned, and circulated them across specific documented historical periods, what broader social, religious, and intellectual currents doubled shaped their content and reception, and how the text's reputation and cultural significance have evolved across the centuries examined throughout this video, all of which are genuinely answerable. Evidence-based historical questions entirely separate from any question of supernatural efficacy. This methodological clarity, treating the historical and cultural study of a text like the Lemegeton as entirely separate from any claim about its supernatural content, is itself a genuinely useful framework for any viewer approaching this entire subject, allowing for serious, intellectually honest engagement with a genuinely fascinating and historically significant body of literature and cultural history, without requiring the viewer to adopt any particular personal position regarding the underlying supernatural or religious claims the text itself makes. A framework this video has tried to maintain consistently throughout its preceding sections, and one that the next section extends as we turn to consider the specific structural content and internal organisation of the modern published Lemegeton, examined strictly as a matter of historical and literary description rather than practical instruction. It is possible and genuinely useful for completing an honest historical account of this text to describe the basic internal structure and organisation of the modern published Lemegeton in general, historically descriptive terms without walking through or reproducing any of its specific operative ritual content, named spirit catalogues or procedural instructions, in the same way that a serious historian might describe the general structure and organisational logic of a historical legal code or administrative manual, without reproducing its specific operative legal text in full. As discussed earlier in this video, the modern published text is traditionally organised into 5 component sections, often referred to as books, each reflecting a somewhat distinct underlying manuscript and textual tradition that was drawn together by the editorial process examined in earlier sections. The first and most well-known of these component sections consists of a structured catalogue, organising a substantial number of named entities according to a hierarchical ranking system loosely modelled on systems of earthly nobility and military rank, a structural choice that reflects a broader and historically well-documented tendency within early modern European demonological literature, examined in Section 5 to organise and systematise demonological material using administrative and hierarchical frameworks borrowed from contemporary earthly political and military organisation, reflecting the broader early modern intellectual impulse towards systematic classification that characterised much of the period's scholarly literature across multiple subjects, not only demonology. The remaining 4 component sections of the traditional Lemegeton structure draw on different underlying textual traditions, including material more closely related to angelic invocation literature, material reflecting astrological and talismanic traditions connected to the older Key of Solomon tradition discussed earlier in this video, and material addressing ritual purification and preparatory procedure, reflecting the broader grimoire tradition's general emphasis, documented extensively in the academic literature on Western esotericism, on structured preparatory ritual, as a conceptually important component of the broader magical framework these texts collectively represent. The text as a whole, considered purely as a historical literary artifact rather than as a practical manual, reflects a genuinely distinctive and historically significant example of early modern European systematizing impulse applied to esoteric and demonological subject matter, organizing an enormous, sprawling, multi-century body of inherited legend, theological speculation, and folk belief into a structured, list-based, almost bureaucratic format that scholars of the broader grimoire tradition have noted bears interesting structural similarities to other contemporary early modern attempts at comprehensive classification and cataloguing across entirely unrelated fields, including early modern natural history, taxonomy, and encyclopedic literature more broadly. This structural observation that the Lemegeton's organizational logic reflects a broader early modern European intellectual tendency toward comprehensive systematic classification, rather than representing some entirely unique or anomalous literary form, is one of the genuinely interesting contributions that serious academic scholarship on Western esotericism has made to understanding texts like this one, situating them within a broader, historically coherent intellectual context rather than treating them as a wholly separate, inexplicable category of literature standing entirely outside the broader currents of early modern European thought. Understanding the text in these historically and structurally descriptive terms, rather than through either the lens of practical magical instruction or the lens of sensationalized popular danger, allows for a genuinely richer historical appreciation of what the Lemegeton actually represents as a historical document, a point the next section extends as we turn specifically to how the Lemegeton fits within and compares to the broader category of related Solomonic and demonological grimoires that circulated across the same general historical period. The Lesser Key of Solomon does not stand alone in the broader historical landscape of Solomonic and demonological grimoire literature, and understanding its specific relationship to several closely related texts that circulated across the same general historical period helps clarify both what is genuinely distinctive about the Lemegeton specifically, and what it shares with a much broader, interconnected body of related literature that developed across medieval and early modern Europe. The Key of Solomon, the older and more astrologically and talismanically focused text discussed in Section 3, represents the most directly related text within this broader tradition, with the Lemegeton's traditional title explicitly positioning itself as a smaller companion work to this older and more established text. Beyond this most direct relationship, the broader Solomonic grimoire tradition includes several other related texts that circulated across overlapping historical periods and overlapping networks of collectors and copyists, including texts like the Grimorium Verum and the Grand Grimoire, both of which emerged from broadly similar early modern European intellectual and cultural contexts, drawing on substantially overlapping source material, including the same broader 16th and 17th century demonological scholarship discussed in Section 5, while developing their own somewhat distinct structural organization, regional textual variations, and specific content emphases. Scholars of the broader grimoire tradition have noted that these various related texts frequently borrowed directly from one another, in some documented cases reproducing substantial blocks of nearly identical material with only minor variation, reflecting the broader pattern of manuscript circulation, copying and cross-pollination that characterized this entire category of literature across the period, a pattern that makes drawing entirely clean, separate boundaries between these various related texts considerably more difficult than the distinct, separately named titles might initially suggest to a casual reader encountering them for the first time. This broader textual family also connects through documented lines of historical influence and source borrowing to related but historically and culturally distinct traditions developed within parallel European esoteric currents, including various traditions of folk magic, astrological talismanic practice, and popular charm literature that circulated more widely among broader, less specifically literate or specialist populations across early modern Europe, reflecting a genuinely complex, multi-layered historical landscape in which elite, Latin literate, manuscript-based grimoire literature existed alongside and in documented cases of cross-influence and borrowing intersected with broader popular folk magical traditions and practices that circulated through oral transmission and considerably less formal written channels among much wider segments of the general population. Recognizing the Lemegeton's place within this broader, genuinely interconnected textual family helps correct a common popular misconception that treats the text as an entirely unique, singular artifact standing in isolation, when the actual historical reality as documented by serious academic scholarship on the subject, reveals a much richer, more interconnected picture of a broad, multi-century European tradition of esoteric and demonological literature, of which the specific text now known as the Lesser Key of Solomon represents one particularly well documented and, due to its specific 20th century editorial and publishing history, discussed in sections 8 through 11, particularly widely known example, but by no means an isolated or entirely unprecedented one. In the next section, we turn to consider how the broader category of Western esoteric and grimoire literature that the Lemegeton belongs to has been treated and understood within the comparative context of similar magical and ritual literary traditions documented in other non-European cultural and religious contexts around the world. While the specific historical focus of this video is centered on the European Solomonic grimoire tradition that the Lemegeton belongs to, it's worth briefly placing this tradition within a broader comparative context, recognizing that structured written traditions of ritual and magical literature, organizing knowledge about spirits, supernatural forces, and ritual practice into systematic textual form are by no means a uniquely European historical phenomenon, even though the specific cultural, religious, and historical particulars examined throughout this video are distinctly tied to the European medieval and early modern context that actually produced the Lemegeton specifically. Scholars of comparative religion and the history of magic have documented broadly similar impulses towards systematizing and textualizing ritual and magical knowledge across numerous other historical and cultural contexts around the world, including substantial bodies of ritual and magical literature developed within various South and Southeast Asian religious traditions, various textual traditions associated with East Asian Taoist and folk religious practice, and various textual traditions developed within different periods and regions of the broader Islamic world. The last of which, as discussed earlier in section 2 regarding the broader Solomon legend, maintained documented historical points of contact and mutual influence with the specifically European grimoire tradition this video is focused on, particularly through the considerable scholarly and cultural exchange that occurred between the Islamic world and medieval Latin Europe across the medieval period. This broader comparative perspective is useful for situating the European grimoire tradition, and the Lemegeton specifically, within a wider pattern that scholars of comparative religion have identified across numerous, historically unconnected human societies. A recurring human impulse, documented across an extremely wide range of cultural and historical contexts, toward organizing and systematizing belief about supernatural forces, ritual practice, and the relationship between human beings and unseen powers into structured, often hierarchically organized textual or oral traditions, frequently associated with specialized practitioner classes possessing particular training, authority, or claimed access to this systematized knowledge. Recognizing this broader comparative pattern helps avoid a specific kind of historical distortion that sometimes affects popular treatment of European grimoire literature specifically. The tendency to treat this particular European tradition as uniquely strange, uniquely dangerous, or uniquely anomalous within the broader sweep of human history and culture, when the actual comparative historical and anthropological evidence suggests that structured, systematized literature addressing ritual and supernatural practice represents a recurring and genuinely widespread feature of human societies across an extremely broad range of otherwise unconnected historical and cultural contexts, of which the specific European Solomonic tradition examined throughout this video represents one well-documented regional example rather than a uniquely isolated or anomalous historical phenomenon. This comparative framing doesn't diminish the genuine historical specificity, complexity, and significance of the particular European tradition this video is focused on, a tradition with its own distinctly documented manuscript lineage, its own distinctly documented relationship to specific European religious, legal, and intellectual developments, including the witch trial era demonology examined in section 5, and its own distinctly documented 20th century editorial and publishing history examined in sections 8 through 11. But it does provide a useful broader frame for understanding the Lemegeton's place within a much wider, cross-culturally recurring pattern of human textual and ritual practice, rather than treating the European grimoire tradition as some entirely separate, uniquely anomalous category of human cultural production, standing apart from comparable developments documented across numerous other world regions and historical periods. In the next section, we return to a more focused contemporary lens, examining how the Lemegeton specifically functions within contemporary, 21st century practicing esoteric and occult communities as distinct from its broader popular cultural reception, examined earlier in sections 11 and 12. Beyond its broader popular cultural visibility and its position as a subject of serious academic historical study, the Lesser Key of Solomon continues to occupy an active, if relatively small and specialized, position within contemporary practicing esoteric and occult communities, a dimension of the text's modern existence that is worth understanding separately from both the academic historical lens and the broader diffuse popular cultural lens examined in earlier sections of this video. Contemporary practitioners operating within various branches of the broader Western esoteric tradition, including various groups and individuals tracing their lineage and practice back through the Golden Dawn and Thelemic traditions discussed in sections 8 and 9, as well as broader contemporary movements sometimes grouped under labels like modern ceremonial magic or chaos magic, continue to study, discuss, and in various documented cases incorporate material drawn from the Lemegeton and the broader Solomonic Grimoire tradition into their own contemporary practice, generally understanding and presenting this practice within their own internal religious, spiritual, or philosophical frameworks, which vary considerably across different contemporary groups and individual practitioners, and which fall outside the scope of historical description this video is aimed to maintain throughout. Scholars of contemporary religion who study modern Western esoteric and occult communities as the living, ongoing, religious and cultural phenomenon, rather than purely as historical subject matter, have documented a genuinely wide range of different interpretive frameworks that contemporary practitioners bring to historical grimoire material, including the Lemegeton, ranging from frameworks that treat the text content in broadly literal terms consistent with its original early modern demonological context, to frameworks that reinterpret the text content in primarily psychological or symbolic terms, treating named entities and described practices as representing internal psychological or archetypal processes rather than external supernatural beings, an interpretive approach with documented roots extending back at least to certain strands of early 20th century psychological and esoteric thought, including specific psychological interpretive frameworks developed by some Golden Dawn-associated figures and subsequently elaborated by various 20th century esoteric writers and teachers. This contemporary practitioner dimension of the text's ongoing existence is worth acknowledging as a genuine, sociologically documented contemporary phenomenon, studied seriously by scholars of contemporary religion as part of the broader academic study of new and minority religious movements, without this video taking any position regarding the validity, efficacy, or wisdom of any particular contemporary interpretive or practical approach to the material, a question that falls outside both the historical scope this video has tried to maintain and the appropriate boundaries of the kind of careful source-grounded historical description this entire video has aimed to provide throughout. What is worth noting, purely as a matter of documented contemporary social and religious history, is that the text examined throughout this video has not remained a purely historical artifact confined to academic study and popular cultural reference, but continues to function as a living component of various ongoing contemporary religious and esoteric communities and practices, a genuinely significant fact about the text's contemporary cultural position that complements, rather than contradicts, the broader historical account this video has constructed across its preceding sections. In the next section, we turn to drawing together some of the broader lessons this entire historical case study offers about how forbidden or banned books more generally function within Western cultural and intellectual history. Stepping back from the specific historical details of the Lemegeton's particular history, examined across the preceding 17 sections of this video, it's worth considering what this specific case study illustrates about the broader historical phenomenon of banned and forbidden books more generally, a category of cultural and intellectual history that extends, of course, far beyond grimoire literature specifically, encompassing an enormous range of other historically banned, censored, or socially stigmatized texts across entirely different subjects, periods, and cultural contexts. One broader lesson this specific case illustrates clearly is the way that a text's reputation for danger and forbidden status frequently outlives, and in many documented cases substantially diverges from, the actual specific historical circumstances that originally produced that reputation. The Lemegeton's modern popular reputation as a uniquely dangerous and forbidden book draws on a genuinely complicated, multi-layered historical foundation, including real documented historical danger associated with magical practice and grimoire ownership during specific periods discussed in Section 6, Real documented entanglement with one of European history's genuinely dark chapters in the witch trial era, demonology discussed in Section 5, and real documented 20th century reputational inheritance from Crowley's specific editorial involvement discussed in Sections 9 and 10. But this genuinely complicated historical foundation has, as discussed in Sections 11 and 12, become substantially flattened, exaggerated, and in various specific contemporary popular accounts actively distorted through successive rounds of popular retelling, a pattern that recurring scholarship on the broader history of banned and censored literature suggests is genuinely common across many other historically banned or stigmatized texts as well, not only this specific one. A second broader lesson concerns the way that official suppression, censorship, and social stigma, rather than reliably succeeding at eliminating or suppressing a given body of literature, frequently instead contribute, paradoxically, to that same literature's eventual cultural prominence and persistence, a pattern sometimes discussed by historians and sociologists of censorship under the general heading of the forbidden fruit effect or the Streisand effect in more contemporary terminology, in which the very act of attempting to suppress or restrict access to particular content frequently generates additional curiosity, additional perceived significance, and additional motivation for preservation and eventual circulation, precisely because of rather than despite the attempted suppression. The Lemegeton's specific multi-century history of quiet private preservation through periods of genuine legal danger, examined in Section 7, followed by its eventual considerably more public rediscovery and publication during the Victorian occult revival and subsequent 20th century Thelemic publishing efforts, examined in Sections 8 and 9, illustrates this broader pattern in a particularly clear and well-documented way. A third and final broader lesson concerns the genuine value of careful, patient, well-sourced, historical inquiry into even the most sensationalized and popularly mythologized historical subjects, a value this entire video has tried to demonstrate concretely through its own structure and approach. The actual documented history of the Lemegeton, traced carefully across the preceding sections of this video through its roots in an ancient Solomon legend, its compilation within the broader medieval and early modern European grimoire tradition, its genuinely complicated and historically significant entanglement with witch trial-era demonological scholarship, its specific documented manuscript preservation and eventual Victorian-era and 20th century editorial and publishing history, and its ongoing contemporary cultural and religious significance, turns out to be considerably richer, more historically interesting, and in its own way more genuinely compelling than the comparatively thin, frequently inaccurate, and often simply invented claims that circulate widely in much contemporary popular content on the subject, a pattern that likely holds true. This broader case study suggests for a great many other historically banned, censored, or popularly mythologized books and subjects well beyond this specific one. In our final two sections, we turn to gathering together the strongest overall historical assessment this video can offer, before closing with some final reflections on the Lemegeton's enduring place in Western cultural history. We have now traced the lesser key of Solomon across nearly 2,000 years of cultural and textual history, beginning with the transformation of a Bronze Age Israelite king's biblical reputation for wisdom into a sprawling, centuries-long legendary tradition of supernatural mastery, moving through the development of the broader medieval and early modern European grimoire tradition that eventually produced the specific compiled text we now recognize by this name, sitting honestly with the genuinely dark historical context of witch trial-era demonological scholarship that the text's core catalogue material draws on, examining the real documented legal and ecclesiastical dangers associated with grimoire literature across various periods of European history, and following the text's specific traceable path from quiet private antiquarian preservation through the Victorian occult revival and into its widely circulated 20th century published form, shaped substantially by the editorial work of one of modern esotericism's most genuinely complicated and controversial figures. We then turn to the text's considerably more diffuse and considerably less historically careful contemporary popular cultural reception, examining how its imagery and reputation have been absorbed, diluted, and in many cases substantially distorted through decades of popular horror and fantasy media, and how a contemporary internet information environment has produced a considerable volume of exaggerated or simply invented popular claims about the text that serious academic historical scholarship does not actually support. We balance this against the genuinely valuable, methodologically careful work being done within the developing academic field of Western esotericism studies, work that treats the historical and cultural study of texts like this one as a legitimate and important subject of serious scholarly inquiry, entirely separate from any question regarding the literal truth of the supernatural claims such texts contain. We place the specifically European Solomonic Grimoire tradition within a broader comparative context of similar systematizing impulses documented across numerous other, historically unconnected world cultures, and we acknowledge the text's genuine, ongoing, sociologically documented contemporary life within various living practitioner communities, a dimension of its existence separate from both its historical and its popular cultural reception. So what should you actually take away from this entire long historical journey? I think the most honest answer is this. The Lesser Key of Solomon is neither the simple, singular, uniquely dangerous artifact that centuries of popular legend and more recent internet-era exaggeration have sometimes made it out to be, nor is it a trivial historical curiosity unworthy of serious, careful attention. It is a genuinely fascinating, genuinely historically significant document precisely because of how clearly and how richly it illustrates several much broader patterns in Western cultural and intellectual history. The way ancient legendary reputations can be built, layer by layer, onto historical figures across many centuries. The way bodies of literature can be compiled, edited, and reshaped by successive generations of largely anonymous scribes and collectors, long before any single author's name becomes attached to a final recognizable form. The way genuine historical danger, real persecution, and serious intellectual controversy can become entangled with a text's later popular reputation in ways that are considerably more complicated than simple categories of dangerous or harmless can fully capture, and the enduring, apparently near universal human fascination, documented across an extraordinarily wide range of otherwise unconnected cultures and historical periods, with the idea of structured, recoverable, systematized knowledge about the boundary between the visible and the unseen world. Whatever your own personal view on the underlying supernatural claims this text and its broader tradition make, a question this video has deliberately and consistently left to you rather than attempting to answer, understanding the actual, carefully documented, genuinely complicated history behind one of the most famous and most mythologized books in the Western esoteric tradition gives you a far richer, far more historically grounded appreciation of why this particular text has continued to fascinate, frighten, and intrigue readers across nearly 2,000 years of continuous cultural transformation than either uncritical sensationalism or dismissive indifference ever could. Thank you for walking through this long and genuinely complicated history with me. Whatever you take from it, I hope, it leaves you with a clearer, more honest map of the actual historical territory behind one of the world's most enduringly notorious books.